My mother crossed her arms and told me to pack my bags because my sister needed the master suite. My father threw my old car keys onto the hardwood floor and casually added that I would still be paying the $3,500 a month for rent and utilities because nobody in his house gets a free ride. I did not argue or cry. I simply packed my suitcases quietly and walked out into the night. Exactly 1 week later, they were begging me to come back. Before I tell you how I legally dismantled my family fake empire, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe to hear what happens when the family scapegoat is secretly the one holding the deed to the entire estate. The air in our upscale Atlanta suburban home felt thick with expensive perfume and unearned arrogance. I stood in the center of the sunken living room holding a stack of my own work files. Brenda, my mother, stood by the marble fireplace polishing a silver cross she bought to impress the church elders. She was preparing for her weekly Bible study, where she would undoubtedly brag about her perfect family. She did not even look at me when she delivered the news. "Pack your things by tonight, Justine," she said, her tone as casual as if she were asking me to take out the trash. "Your sister is coming back home and she needs the master bedroom. You can figure something else out." I stared at the woman who had spent my entire 29 years of life treating me like hired help rather than a daughter. Before I could process the sheer audacity of being evicted from the room I had occupied and maintained Calvin, my father marched into the living room. He was wearing his favorite tailored suit, the one he wore to board meetings for companies that had stopped returning his calls years ago. He tossed a set of scratched keys onto the pristine hardwood floor right at my feet. The metal clattered loudly, echoing against the high ceilings. "Take the old Honda," he commanded, adjusting his gold cufflinks. "We need the garage space for your sister. And just so we are clear, you will continue transferring the $3,500 every month to the family account. Rent and utilities do not stop just because you are moving out. You owe us for raising you and feeding you all these years. That is just fair. Nobody gets a free ride in this family." I looked from the keys on the floor to my father's smug face. The absolute entitlement radiated from him. He genuinely believed that giving birth to me was a financial investment that I was obligated to pay dividends on for the rest of my life. For years, I had silently funded their lavish lifestyle. They thought I was just a lowly office cleaner who got lucky with a steady paycheck. They had no idea I was a senior corporate liquidator, a financial forensic specialist who dismantled bankrupt empires for a living. I dealt with ruthless billionaires every day, yet here were my parents trying to extort me like a neighborhood bully. I opened my mouth to speak, but the heavy oak front door swung open, bringing the next wave of my nightmare directly into the foyer. Monique paraded into the house like she had just won a beauty pageant. At 26, my younger sister was the undisputed golden child of the family. She had a modest following on social media, built entirely on posting pictures of luxury vacations and designer handbags that I had unknowingly financed. Clinging tightly to her arm was Spencer. Spencer was 30 years old, white, and wore a linen suit that screamed old money, but looked suspiciously wrinkled around the elbows. He was Monique's new fiancé, a self-proclaimed venture capitalist who talked constantly about cryptocurrency and disruptive markets. My parents treated him like absolute royalty, simply because of his skin color and his supposed wealth, desperate to marry into what they perceived as high society. "Look who is still here," Monique sneered, dropping her imported leather bags right on top of my work shoes. "I thought you would be packing by now, Justine. The smell of cheap office coffee is really ruining the aesthetic of my homecoming." Spencer let out a loud, obnoxious laugh that grated against my ears. He stepped past me deliberately, bumping my shoulder, and looked around the expansive living room with a critical, condescending eye. "This place is going to need a massive overhaul," Brenda Spencer said to my mother, using her first name with a complete lack of respect that she somehow found incredibly charming. "I need Justine room cleared out completely by morning. The feng shui is terrible, and I need a massive space for my crypto trading office. I have a team of developers in Europe waiting on my signals, and I cannot work in a room that smells like minimum wage desperation." Brenda actually giggled, reaching out to pat Spencer's arm. Oh, do not worry about Justine Spencer. She is leaving tonight. We are so thrilled to have a real businessman in the house. Your startup is going to bring so much prestige to our family name. I watched this sickening exchange without blinking. Spencer was a parasite. My trained eye had already caught the signs. His watch was a convincing fake. His shoes were scuffed at the heels in a way that meant they were his only good pair. But my parents were too blinded by their own desperation for status to see the truth. They were kicking out their own flesh and blood to make room for a con artist. "Justine, are you deaf?" Calvin barked, stepping toward me aggressively. I said, "Go pack your bags, and do not forget to set up the recurring bank transfer before you leave. Spencer needs capital for his trading monitors, and as your sister's sibling, you should be honored to contribute to his success." I looked at the four of them standing together. A perfect portrait of toxic delusion. A normal person would have screamed. A normal person would have thrown the files in their face, demanded respect, and fought for their place in the home. But I was not just a normal person. I was a professional liquidator. I knew that the best way to destroy a bad business was to cut off the cash flow and let it collapse under its own weight. This family was the worst business I had ever seen. I bent down and slowly picked up the old Honda keys from the floor. I looked directly into my father's eyes and gave him a calm, measured nod. "You are right, Dad," I said, my voice eerily steady. "Nobody gets a free ride. I will make sure the finances are handled exactly as they should be." Monique rolled her eyes, flipping her hair over her shoulder. "Good, because Spencer and I need to start redecorating tomorrow. Leave your keys on the counter. You will not be needing access to the house anymore." I did not waste another breath on them. I turned on my heel and walked up the sweeping staircase to the master bedroom I had occupied for the past 4 years. I pulled my suitcases from the closet and began packing. I did not take the furniture I had bought. I did not take the expensive bedding or the electronics. I only packed my personal clothing, my laptop, and a locked metal briefcase containing my most sensitive financial documents. Downstairs, I could hear the clinking of champagne glasses. I could hear Spencer loudly bragging about a non-existent yacht in Miami. I could hear my mother praising the Lord for bringing such a generous provider into their lives. Every laugh, every boast, every clink of glass sealed their fate in my mind. I zipped up my suitcases, took one last look at the room, and walked back downstairs. The four of them were gathered around the kitchen island. Nobody offered to help me with my bags. Nobody asked where I was going to sleep that night. My mother simply reminded me to leave the house keys by the fruit bowl. I placed the keys exactly where she asked. "Enjoy the house," I told them softly. "I hope it brings you everything you deserve." I walked out the front door and pulled it shut behind me, severing the last emotional tie I had to the people inside. The night air was humid and heavy as I loaded my bags into the trunk of the waiting taxi. I did not bother taking the old Honda my father had thrown at me. I slid into the back seat of the cab and gave the driver the address to a luxury high-rise building downtown where I had quietly purchased a penthouse apartment 2 years ago. As the cab pulled away from the suburban neighborhood, I pulled my laptop from my bag and opened it on my lap. The screen illuminated the dark back seat as I logged into my primary banking portal. For 4 years, I had been the invisible pillar holding up my parents' crumbling facade of wealth. I clicked on the Scheduled Transfers tab. There it was. The automatic monthly payment of $3,500 directed to an account named Family Real Estate Trust. My parents believed this was my rent and utility contribution for living in their home. What they did not understand, what they were too arrogant to ever investigate, was that the Family Real Estate Trust was a holding company entirely owned by me. 4 years ago, when Calvin bankrupted his contracting business, the bank was days away from foreclosing on the house. To spare him the ultimate community humiliation, I used my corporate connections to quietly buy the foreclosed debt. I let them believe they had successfully restructured their loan. The money they demanded from me every month was actually paying the property taxes and insurance on a house that belonged exclusively to me. I hovered my cursor over the auto-pay authorization. With one satisfying click, I canceled the transfer. I then opened my email and drafted a quick message to my property management attorney. The instructions were simple. Cease all tax and insurance payments for the suburban property immediately. Let all notices default to the physical address. I closed the laptop, leaned my head back against the leather seat, and watched the city lights blur past the window. I felt no guilt, only the cold, precise satisfaction of a ledger balancing out to zero. Exactly 7 days later, I was sitting in my corner office reviewing a liquidation portfolio when my personal cell phone began to vibrate violently across my glass desk. The screen flashed with my father's name. I let it ring until it went to voicemail, then listened as his panicked voice filled the quiet room. "Justine, pick up the phone right now. The power company just shut off the electricity. There is a man in a suit taping a bright yellow notice to our front door saying the property taxes are delinquent and the house is going up for public auction in 15 days. What is going on? You better transfer that money right now or I swear to God I will ruin you." I deleted the voicemail, picked up my pen, and smiled. The eviction had just begun. The morning sun reflected off the floor-to-ceiling glass windows of my corner office, illuminating the polished mahogany desk where I sat overlooking the Atlanta skyline. For a woman my parents believed pushed a broom and emptied trash cans for a living, I had certainly managed to secure a breathtaking view. In reality, this office was the nerve center of one of the most ruthless corporate liquidation firms in the Southeast, and I was its senior director. My days were spent dissecting the financial failures of arrogant executives, carving up their bankrupt empires, and selling off the pieces to the highest bidder. I dealt in cold hard fax numbers that never lied and contracts that showed no mercy. So when my personal cell phone vibrated across the glass surface of my desk, flashing my father's name for the 7th time that morning, I did not feel panic. I felt the familiar clinical detachment I reserved for my most desperate clients. I picked up the phone and pressed answer, letting the silence stretch for a moment. "Justine, what is wrong with you?" Calvin's voice exploded through the speaker so loud I had to pull the phone an inch away from my ear. His usual manufactured baritone, the one he used to impress the deacons at church, was entirely gone, replaced by the frantic pitch of a man watching his house of cards collapse. "You better tell me there is a glitch with the bank. The power company just sent a shut-off notice and I have a property tax default warning taped to my front door. Transfer the $3,500 right now." I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair, picking up a silver pen and twirling it between my fingers. "I am afraid there is no glitch, Dad," I said, my voice perfectly level. "I canceled the recurring transfer the moment you threw my car keys on the floor and told me to vacate the premises. You made it very clear that nobody in your house gets a free ride. Since I no longer reside in that house, I am no longer funding the ride." "Are you out of your mind?" Calvin sputtered, the sound of his heavy breathing echoing through the receiver. "You owe us that money. You think you can just walk away and leave us high and dry." "I have obligations, Justine. I have a lifestyle to maintain. You know perfectly well I drained the last of my retirement account to buy that 30-foot cruiser last month." The guys at the lodge were starting to talk, looking at me like I was some kind of failure. I had to show them I am still a player in this town. "You know the boat payments take up my entire Social Security check. I need your transfer to cover the house." I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, marveling at the absolute delusion of the man. He had literally spent his pension on a boat he could not afford, just to impress a group of retired men who did not actually care about him, all while secretly relying on the daughter he treated like a peasant to keep the lights on in his home. It was a classic case of narcissistic financial mismanagement. I see this every day in my line of work. Men who buy luxury assets to mask their insolvent reality. "Your boat payments are not my liability, Dad," I replied, keeping my tone strictly professional. "You evicted your primary revenue stream to make room for a man who wears fake designer suits. Perhaps you should ask Spencer to dip into his massive crypto fortune to pay your property taxes. After all, he needs the good feng shui." There was a moment of stunned silence on the other end of the line, followed by the unmistakable sound of the phone being snatched away. When the voice returned, it was Brenda. My mother had dropped her sweet church lady facade entirely. Her voice was sharp, venomous, and dripping with the kind of condescension she usually reserved for retail workers. "Listen to me, you ungrateful little girl," Brenda hissed. "You are going to log into your little bank account and fix this immediately. We gave you life. We put a roof over your head when you had nowhere else to go. You think because you have a steady paycheck from whatever little cleaning service you work for that you can suddenly disrespect your family. You are nothing without us." I looked around my expansive office, taking in the original abstract art on the walls, the multi-line phone system routing international calls, and the stack of million-dollar asset portfolios waiting for my signature. My mother genuinely believed I was scrubbing toilets. She had never once asked for the name of my company, never asked what my actual job title was, and never cared enough to find out how I was able to afford a $3,500 monthly payment on a supposed janitorial salary. "I am not fixing anything, Brenda," I said, choosing to use her first name, just as her precious future son-in-law had done. "You wanted the master bedroom for your golden child. You got it. Actions have financial consequences. I suggest you start packing up your expensive china before the bank comes to collect it." "You listen to me," Brenda shrieked, her voice echoing in the quiet luxury of my office. "If you do not wire that money by noon, I am going to come down to your workplace. I will walk right into the lobby of your cleaning company, and I will demand to see your manager. I will tell them exactly what kind of thief they have on their payroll. I will make such a scene they will have no choice but to fire you. You think you can humiliate us? I will destroy your little job, and then you will be begging to come back home." A genuine smile finally broke across my face. The threat was so absurd, so completely detached from reality that it was almost poetic. I imagined my mother storming into the lobby of this high-security corporate building, demanding to see the manager of the cleaning staff, only to be escorted by armed guards to the executive floor, where she would find me sitting behind a desk that cost more than her entire car. I dared her to do it. "Write this down," I said, my voice turning dangerously soft. 300 Peachtree Street, floor 42. Tell the concierge at the security desk you are looking for Justine. I highly encourage you to come down here and make a scene, Brenda. Please tell my boss exactly who I am. I would love to see how that plays out for you." She scoffed, a sound of pure arrogance. "You think I will not do it? You are playing a very dangerous game, Justine. You have until noon." She slammed the phone down, terminating the call. I placed my cell phone back on the desk and let out a long, slow breath. They were flailing. The panic was setting in, and instead of evaluating their own mistakes, they were doubling down on intimidation. It was textbook behavior for people who had lived their entire lives on borrowed prestige. Just as the silence settled back into my office, the heavy oak door creaked open. Chloe, my executive assistant, stepped into the room. She was a sharp, highly efficient woman who knew better than to ask questions about my personal life. She walked briskly across the plush carpet and placed a thick manila folder directly in the center of my desk. "The background check you requested on the subject, Spencer Davis," she said, tapping the cover of the file. "Our private investigators expedited the process. You were right to be suspicious, Justine. His financial footprint is an absolute disaster." "Thank you, Chloe," I said, pulling the file toward me. "Hold all my calls for the next 20 minutes unless it is the liquidators in Chicago." She nodded and slipped out of the room, closing the door silently behind her. I stared at the manila folder for a moment. Spencer, the supposed venture capitalist, the man my parents had deemed worthy of my bedroom, the white savior who was going to elevate our family social standing with his cryptocurrency empire. From the moment I saw his scuffed shoes and the cheap stitching on his lapel, I knew he was a fraud. Now I was holding the absolute proof. I opened the folder and began flipping through the heavily detailed pages. Our investigators had pulled everything. Tax records, limited liability company registrations, civil court judgments, and property deeds. I skipped past the long list of unpaid credit card debts and went straight to the corporate filings. Spencer had registered a company called Apex Digital Holdings just 6 months ago. On paper, it sounded impressive. The business registration claimed a massive operating budget and a prime headquarters address in a supposed tech district. I pulled out the specific page showing his corporate address. I turned to my computer and typed the address into a satellite mapping program. I waited as the screen zoomed in on the location, dropping a digital pin on Spencer, highly touted startup headquarters. The image rendered in high definition, and I let out a sharp laugh. There was no tech building, there was no bustling office full of European developers waiting on his trading signals. The address, officially registered to Apex Digital Holdings, belonged to an abandoned parking lot completely overgrown with weeds. It was situated right next to a burnt-out diner with a collapsed roof in one of the most neglected industrial zones in the state. Spencer was not a venture capitalist. He was a low-rent scam artist running a ghost company out of a literal wasteland, and my parents had just kicked me out to hand him the keys to their kingdom. The 2 evenings following my eviction were a blur of high-stakes negotiations and endless financial audits. I was currently sitting in a secluded leather booth at the Sovereign, one of the most exclusive dining establishments in the city. The ambient lighting was low, casting a warm golden hue over the polished mahogany tables, and the hum of polite conversation perfectly masked the sound of clinking crystal glasses. I was not there to relax. I was hosting a private dinner with Marcus Thorne, the managing director of a massive private equity firm. Marcus was a man who moved billions of dollars across international borders, and he relied heavily on my forensic liquidation skills to identify which failing tech companies were worth stripping for parts and which were absolute garbage. We were deep in a discussion about acquiring the assets of a collapsed logistics firm when a sudden burst of shrill, obnoxious laughter shattered the refined atmosphere of the dining room. I did not even have to turn my head to know who it was. My mother has a distinctive high-pitched cackle that carries like a siren, and it easily cut over the soft jazz playing in the background. I took a slow sip of my sparkling water and glanced toward the hostess stand. There they were: Brenda, Calvin, Monique, and Spencer. They looked entirely out of place, like a loud, chaotic parade interrupting a quiet library. My mother was draped in a dress covered in oversized designer logos, a desperate attempt to broadcast wealth that actually screamed profound insecurity. Calvin was wearing the exact same tired suit he had worn the day he kicked me out. Monique was clinging tightly to Spencer's arm, practically vibrating with unearned arrogance. They were clearly there to celebrate their new living arrangement and Spencer's supposed financial triumphs. I turned my attention back to Marcus, keeping my expression entirely neutral. I had genuinely hoped they would be seated on the opposite side of the expansive dining room. But the universe has a funny way of forcing confrontations when you least desire them. The hostess guided them to a large round table directly in my line of sight. It took exactly 4 minutes for Monique to spot me. I saw her eyes widen dramatically as she took in my presence. She looked at my tailored silk blouse, which had no visible logos but cost more than her entire seasonal wardrobe. She looked at Marcus, who was wearing a bespoke suit and radiating quiet, intimidating power. I could practically see the gears grinding in my sister's head. She could not comprehend how the family disappointment the lowly office cleaner was sitting in a restaurant where the waiting list was typically 6 months long. Monique whispered something to my mother and pointed shamelessly in my direction. Brenda's face immediately contorted into a mask of pure indignation. She tapped Calvin on the shoulder, and within seconds, the entire group was glaring at my table. I did not break eye contact with Marcus. I continued explaining the rapid depreciation of commercial real estate assets, but I kept my peripheral vision locked on my family. I knew they would not be able to resist coming over. They fed on drama, and they constantly needed to assert their dominance to feel important. Well, 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 look who decided to show her face in public. Monique's voice cut through the space between our tables, loud enough for the neighboring diners to turn their heads in annoyance. She marched over to my booth, with Spencer trailing closely behind her like a loyal, obedient dog. My parents followed their faces, set in twin expressions of absolute contempt. Monique stood right next to my table, looking me up and down with a deep, condescending sneer. I am honestly shocked they let you in here, Justine, she said, crossing her arms. Did you have to save up your cleaning wages for 6 months just to afford a side salad, or did you trick this poor man into paying for your meal today? Marcus raised a single eyebrow, looking from Monique to me. He was a man who despised unprofessional behavior, but he remained perfectly silent, allowing me the space to handle the intrusion. I placed my silver fork down carefully on the pristine white tablecloth. I am having a private business meeting, Monique. I said, my voice low and dangerously calm. I suggest you return to your table and enjoy your meal before you embarrass yourself further. Oh, a business meeting. Monique laughed, a sharp, grating sound that echoed awkwardly. Right. Since when do janitors have high-level business meetings? You're probably just trying to hustle some poor guy into paying the rent you owe mom and dad. You know it is incredibly selfish of you to just abandon your family and turn off your phone when you owe us. Mom has been crying all week because you are so ungrateful. Spencer stepped forward, puffed up his chest, and attempted to look incredibly intimidating. He rested one hand on the back of my booth, deliberately invading my personal space. The heavy scent of his cheap, overly strong cologne wafted over my plate, ruining my appetite. Come on, Justine, Spencer said, using a tone he probably thought sounded authoritative, but actually sounded incredibly weak. You cannot just run away from your responsibilities like a child. Calvin and Brenda gave you everything. They put a solid roof over your head. The least you can do is help out with the utility bills now that you threw a tantrum and left. It is called being a decent human being. You should really try it sometime. I looked up at Spencer. I looked at his fake luxury watch with the slightly misaligned dial and his severely scuffed shoes. I looked at the man who was running a fraudulent ghost company out of an abandoned parking lot while standing here lecturing me about fiscal responsibility. I felt a cold, absolute clarity wash over my mind. I did not raise my voice. I did not break a sweat. I simply leaned back in my leather seat and folded my hands neatly on my lap. Spencer reached into the inner pocket of his wrinkled jacket and pulled out his wallet. He made a great theatrical show of opening it, extracting a single crisp $100 bill. He tossed it onto my table, letting it land right next to my crystal water glass. There he said, a deeply smug smile spreading across his face. That is for your dinner tonight. Take whatever you have left over from your little meal and give it directly to your father. Maybe if you stop eating at places you clearly cannot afford, you will not have to dodge their phone calls like a total coward. My father, Calvin, puffed out his chest, clearly emboldened by Spencer's aggressive display. That is exactly right, Calvin boomed, his voice echoing rudely through the upscale restaurant. You should be deeply ashamed of yourself, Justine. Look at Spencer. This is what a real provider looks like. He just closed a massive cryptocurrency deal today while you are out here playing dress-up with strangers. You need to learn your place in this world. I let the heavy silence hang in the air for 5 long seconds. I looked at the $100 bill sitting on the white linen. Then I shifted my gaze directly to Spencer. You just closed a massive cryptocurrency deal? I asked, my tone completely flat and devoid of emotion. Is that so? Spencer smirked, adjusting his collar. Absolutely. 7 figures easy. The market is highly volatile right now, but my proprietary algorithm predicted the exact bottom of the dip. We leveraged a massive short position against decentralized finance tokens. It takes a certain level of genius to read the charts accurately. You would not understand the logistics of it. I smiled. It was not a warm, welcoming smile. It was the smile of a predator circling its trapped prey. That is fascinating, Spencer, I said, locking my eyes onto his. Tell me, how exactly did you leverage a massive short position against decentralized tokens when the current liquidity pools require a baseline capital verification that your company simply does not possess? I mean, according to the Securities and Exchange Commission, your firm Apex Digital Holdings has not filed a single quarterly earnings report since its inception 6 months ago. Spencer's smug smile faltered instantly. His arms uncrossed and his eyes darted nervously toward my parents. What are you talking about? He stammered, his voice losing all its previous bravado. You do not know anything about my company. Oh, but I do, Spencer. I continued, my voice slicing through his fake confidence like a surgical scalpel. I know that your registered corporate headquarters is located at a heavily contested industrial site. I also know that the city zoning board officially condemned that specific address 3 years ago due to toxic runoff. So unless your elite European development team is currently trading cryptocurrency from the back seat of a rusted-out minivan parked in an abandoned lot full of weeds, I would say your seven-figure algorithm is a complete fabrication. The color drained entirely from Spencer's face. He looked like he had just been hit by a speeding freight train. He took a physical step back away from my table, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to find a lie that could cover the massive hole I had just blown in his story. Monique looked at him in total confusion. "Spencer, baby, what is she talking about?" Monique asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Tell her she is crazy." He could not speak. He was suffocating under the weight of his own exposure. He knew exactly what I was saying, and he knew that I had him dead to rights. My father, however, was not bright enough to understand the forensic financial terminology I had just used. Calvin only understood that I was disrespecting the white savior he had pinned all his desperate hopes on. "Shut your mouth!" Calvin roared, stepping forward and slamming his hand down hard on my table. The violent impact rattled the heavy silverware. "How dare you speak to him that way? You know absolutely nothing about business. You are just a bitter, jealous woman who cannot stand to see your sister happy and successful. You have always been a massive disgrace to this family." Calvin swung his arm in a wide, angry gesture. His metal cufflink caught the edge of my heavy crystal water glass. The glass tipped over, spilling ice water all over the pristine tablecloth and splashing directly onto the $100 bill Spencer had thrown at me. The glass rolled off the edge of the table and shattered loudly against the hardwood floor. The sound echoed violently through the entire restaurant. Conversations stopped instantly. Waiters froze in their tracks. Every single eye in the dining room was now fixed entirely on our table. My mother gasped and covered her mouth, pretending to be shocked by the very scene she had helped instigate. Monique looked around nervously, suddenly realizing that her grand public humiliation of me had turned into a massive, highly visible embarrassment for herself. I did not flinch. I did not bother to wipe the few drops of water that had splashed onto my silk sleeve. I simply turned my head and signaled for the manager, who was already rushing toward our table with a look of absolute horror on his face. "Miss Justine," the manager said, his voice trembling as he looked at the shattered glass and the puddle of water. "I am so deeply sorry for this unacceptable disturbance. Shall I have our security team escort these people out of the building immediately?" My parents froze completely. They stared at the manager in absolute shock. They expected him to throw me out for causing a scene. They could not comprehend why the manager of a five-star restaurant was addressing their lowly cleaning woman daughter with such profound, unwavering respect. "That will not be necessary, David," I said calmly, picking up my leather clutch from the seat beside me. "We were just finishing our meeting anyway." I reached into my clutch and pulled out my credit card. It was a heavy, solid, metal black card, available only to individuals with a net worth that my parents could not even begin to fathom. I placed the black card on the dry edge of the table. "Please take care of the bill for my table, David, and go ahead and add a very generous tip for the staff to compensate for the mess on the floor." "Of course, Miss Justine," the manager said, bowing his head slightly as he took the card. Right away, Calvin, Brenda, Monique, and Spencer stood paralyzed. They stared blankly at the black metal card as it was carried away by the manager. The realization was slowly, agonizingly crashing down upon them. They were finally beginning to understand that the narrative they had constructed about my life was entirely false. I was not poor. I was not struggling. I was not the miserable failure they desperately needed me to be. I stood up from the booth, smoothing out the invisible wrinkles in my silk trousers. I looked down at the table and picked up the soggy, waterlogged $100 bill Spencer had so arrogantly dropped in front of me. The paper was dripping wet, but the portrait of Benjamin Franklin was still perfectly visible. I held it casually between my index and middle fingers. I stepped around the puddle of water and stopped directly in front of Spencer. He was sweating profusely now. Actual thick beads of perspiration were forming on his forehead and rolling down his neck. I pressed the wet $100 bill flat against the chest of his cheap wrinkled suit jacket. I patted it once, making sure the damp paper stuck firmly to his lapel. "Keep it, Spencer," I said, my voice carrying clearly in the dead silence of the restaurant. "You are going to need it for your court fees next month." I walked out of the restaurant without looking back, leaving Spencer trembling in his cheap suit and my parents staring in absolute shock. The weekend passed with a deceptive quiet, but I knew my mother too well to think she would accept defeat gracefully. Brenda's weapon of choice had always been public opinion, and her favorite battleground was the Fellowship Community Church. The church was the absolute social epicenter of our local Black community, and my parents treated it like their own personal country club. Sunday morning arrived with the harsh buzzing of my cell phone. I was sitting on my velvet sofa enjoying the quiet peace of my penthouse when the notifications began flooding my screen. It was not just one or two messages. It was an absolute avalanche of digital outrage from people I had not spoken to in years. I opened the first message from my Aunt Martha. She accused me of being a demon child who stole her parents' life savings to buy expensive dinners and designer clothes. The next message was from cousin Sheila, demanding to know how I could sleep at night, while my parents faced imminent homelessness. Then came the messages from the church elders. Sister Mary texted that she was praying for my wicked soul because the love of money was the root of all evil. Deacon Williams sent a long paragraph about the sins of greed and the biblical mandate to honor my father and mother or face divine punishment. It became immediately clear what had happened. Brenda had gone to the early morning service and staged a massive theatrical performance for the entire congregation. Through the onslaught of angry texts, I pieced together the exact narrative my mother had spun for the community. She claimed that I had secretly drained their retirement accounts over the past 4 years before running away in the middle of the night like a thief. She told everyone that the eviction notice currently taped to their front door was entirely my fault because I had taken out secret predatory loans against their property without their knowledge. She painted herself as the ultimate victim, a devoted, loving mother who gave her ungrateful daughter everything only to be left destitute and starving. She even managed to twist the restaurant encounter from the night before, claiming I had stalked them there just to flaunt my stolen wealth and humiliate her innocent future son-in-law Spencer. She told the congregation that Spencer was a brilliant entrepreneur who was trying to save the family from my financial abuse. It was a masterclass in toxic manipulation. My mother knew that in our community, reputation was absolute currency. By turning the entire church against me, she thought she could shame me into submission. She expected me to cave under the weight of communal disapproval and come crawling back to save their public image. She assumed I would pay the bills just to stop the gossip and restore my own standing. I set my phone down on the glass coffee table and took another slow sip of my black coffee. I did not feel angry or betrayed. I felt a cold, clinical satisfaction because my mother had just made the biggest strategic error of her entire life. She had escalated a private financial dispute into a highly public spectacle without realizing that I held all the receipts. She thought she could control the narrative because I had always remained silent in the past. She did not understand that my silence was never weakness. It was preparation. My phone rang loudly, interrupting my thoughts. The caller ID displayed the main office number for the Fellowship Community Church. I pressed answer and held the phone to my ear, letting the heavy silence stretch for a moment. "Justine," the deep disappointed voice of Pastor Thomas filled the line. "I am calling you because your parents are sitting in my office right now and they are completely devastated. Your mother is inconsolable and your father looks like a broken man. I have known your family for 20 years, and I never imagined you could be capable of such profound cruelty against your own flesh and blood. We need you to come down to the church immediately following the morning service. We are going to have a family reconciliation meeting and get to the bottom of this spiritual crisis before the devil destroys your home." I did not argue with him. I did not try to defend myself or explain that my mother was a pathological liar who cared more about appearances than her own children. I simply told him I would be there in 1 hour and ended the call. I walked into my expansive walk-in closet and selected my outfit with absolute precision. I chose a tailored charcoal suit that projected pure corporate authority. I paired it with minimal jewelry and a pair of leather heels that announced my presence with every heavy step. I gathered my documents, placed them carefully into my structured designer tote bag, and took the elevator down to the private garage. My luxury sedan glided smoothly through the Sunday morning traffic toward the suburban church my family had attended since I was a child. The massive parking lot was packed when I arrived. As I walked up the wide concrete steps toward the main entrance, I could feel the heavy judgmental stares of the congregation members who were lingering after the service. Women who had known me since I was in pigtails whispered behind their hands as I passed them by. Men who used to praise my academic achievements looked at me with open disgust. I kept my posture perfectly straight and my expression completely unreadable. I bypassed the main sanctuary and walked directly down the long carpeted hallway leading to the administrative offices. The walls here were lined with framed photos of generous donors, and my father's face smiled proudly from several of them. There was a bronze plaque beneath his portrait, thanking him for his unwavering financial support. I opened the door to the pastor's private study without knocking. The scene inside was exactly as I had pictured it. Brenda was slumped in a plush leather guest chair, clutching a damp tissue to her face, and emitting loud dramatic sobs that sounded entirely rehearsed. Calvin stood behind her, resting a heavy protective hand on her shoulder, while wearing an expression of stoic tragedy. Pastor Thomas sat behind his large mahogany desk, looking at me with severe pastoral disappointment. "Please sit down, Justine, Pastor," Thomas said, gesturing to the empty chair next to my mother. "We have a lot of praying and healing to do today. Your parents have shared the tragic details of your financial betrayal and the horrific way you treated them at the restaurant last night. The Lord teaches us forgiveness, but first there must be repentance and full restitution for the money you have taken from them. Your father is a pillar of this community, Justine. He has given so much of his time and his hard-earned money to uplift this church. It breaks my heart to see his own daughter tear him down to steal from a man who has shown nothing but extraordinary generosity to the house of God." I remained standing near the door. I looked down at my mother, who peered up at me through her fake tears, waiting for me to break down and apologize. She expected me to be intimidated by the religious authority of the pastor. She expected me to shrink back into the obedient, silent daughter I used to be. I did not offer a single excuse. I did not waste my breath trying to explain my side of the story to a man who had already decided I was guilty, based on a theatrical performance. Instead, I reached into my structured tote bag and pulled out a heavy black leather-bound ledger. The book contained hundreds of pages of meticulous financial records, bank statements, wire transfers, and tax documents. It was the complete forensic audit of my parents' financial lives over the past 8 years. I stepped forward and dropped the heavy ledger directly onto the center of Pastor Thomas' desk. The book landed with a loud, definitive thud that echoed in the quiet office and caused my mother to physically jump in her seat. Her fake sobbing stopped instantly. "What is the meaning of this?" Pastor Thomas asked, staring down at the thick black book. I looked directly into his eyes, my voice ringing with cold, absolute authority. "You want to talk about restitution, Pastor," I said smoothly. "You want to talk about the extraordinary generosity my father has shown to this church. I suggest you open that ledger to the section marked with the red tab. It contains the complete financial history of my parents' supposedly generous contributions to this specific institution." Pastor Thomas frowned deeply, but reached out and opened the heavy cover. He flipped past pages of highlighted bank statements until he reached the red tab. His eyes scanned the top document, and I watched the color rapidly drain from his face. My father, Calvin, suddenly looked incredibly nervous, shifting his weight from one foot to the other and pulling his hand away from my mother's shoulder. "You see, Pastor?" I continued, my voice slicing through the tense silence of the room. "My father loves to stand up in front of the congregation and brag about his massive financial tithes. He took all the credit when this church bought the new stained glass windows in the sanctuary. He stood on the altar and soaked up the applause when he supposedly funded the new robes for the entire choir. He even took a commemorative plaque for sponsoring the youth group van last summer." Brenda gripped the armrests of her chair, her knuckles turning white as she realized exactly what I had brought to the meeting. Pastor Thomas looked up from the ledger, his hands shaking slightly as he held the financial statements up to the light. "These documents show that the tithes were paid via credit card," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. He looked at the total balances and the exorbitant interest rates that had been applied over the years. "Yes, they do," I replied, holding his gaze without blinking. "Every single one of those ostentatious, highly publicized church donations over the last 8 years was funded by high-interest credit cards. The stained glass windows cost $15,000. The choir robes were another $8,000. The youth group van was leased using a down payment of $12,000. My father forced me to open those accounts under the guise of building my credit score when I was in college, and then he systematically maxed them out to buy his way into the inner circle of this church. I spent years secretly working overtime to pay off the massive debt he accumulated just so he could look like a wealthy philanthropist on Sunday mornings. And if you look closely at the name registered on every single one of those accounts, you will notice that the money did not come from Calvin or Brenda." The pastor turned pale and swallowed hard as he read the name printed on the billing statements. All the generous church tithes my father had been bragging about to the entire community were actually funded by credit cards solely in my name. I walked out of the administrative office, leaving Pastor Thomas staring blankly at the mountain of credit card statements. The heavy wooden door clicked shut behind me, severing the final thread of obligation I held toward my parents. The morning sun felt incredibly warm as I walked across the vast asphalt parking lot of the Fellowship Community Church. I ignored the hostile glares from the congregation members, who were still lingering near the entrance. They had eagerly consumed my dramatic lies, and now they would eventually have to digest the bitter truth of her financial ruin. I climbed into my luxury sedan and merged onto the highway, letting the steady hum of the engine clear my mind. My mother had played her final card, and it had backfired with catastrophic precision. She tried to use public shame to force me back into submission without realizing that I no longer cared about the opinions of people who only valued my compliance. By Tuesday morning, the world of corporate liquidation demanded my full attention. The petty squabbles of my suburban family faded into the background as I prepared to dismantle a massive failing enterprise. My assistant Chloe walked into my private office holding a fresh intelligence dossier. Our investigative team had not stopped monitoring Spencer and his movements. Chloe stood perfectly straight and delivered a briefing that proved exactly how desperate my family had become. It appeared that after the disastrous church meeting, my parents had returned to their dark, freezing home. The power company had indeed cut the electricity, and the reality of their impending eviction had finally pierced through their armor of arrogance. Spencer saw their panic as the perfect opportunity to execute his ultimate scheme. He needed capital to sustain his illusion of wealth, and my parents were sitting on the one asset he desired, the house. According to the surveillance reports, Spencer had spent Sunday evening feeding my father a magnificent web of lies. I could picture the scene unfolding in the dark living room, illuminated only by the glow of battery-powered lanterns. Spencer would have poured cheap liquor and spoken in that low, conspiratorial tone used by every successful con artist. He likely told Calvin that the traditional financial system was rigged against brilliant men like them. He spun a tale about a proprietary cryptocurrency algorithm that was guaranteed to yield an astronomical return on investment. Spencer convinced my father that they only needed a temporary influx of cash to secure the digital assets. He proposed a rapid mortgage on the suburban house, promising Calvin that he could double their money in less than a week. It was a textbook predatory maneuver designed to exploit a desperate man's fragile ego. Spencer assured my father that this brilliant investment would not only save the house, but would elevate him above all the men at his lodge who had doubted his success. Calvin, blinded by his insatiable need for status, agreed to the scheme without a second thought. He was willing to risk the very roof over his head to maintain a facade of superiority. On Monday morning, Spencer had driven to a dilapidated strip mall to meet with a hard money lender. These types of lenders operated in the shadows of the financial world. They did not care about credit scores or verified income. They only cared about securing physical collateral. The lender informed Spencer that they would approve the high-interest cash loan, but they absolutely required the original physical property deed before they would release a single dollar. This demand must have sparked absolute chaos inside my parents' home. I could easily imagine the frantic scene. My mother and sister tearing through every room, pulling out heavy drawers, and dumping filing cabinets onto the floor. They would have sifted through decades of old tax returns, expired warranties, and useless paperwork. They would have emptied safety deposit boxes and scoured the dusty corners of the attic, their desperation multiplying with every passing hour as they searched for the one document that could save their precious lifestyle. But they would never find the physical deed. They could tear the drywall down to the studs, and they would never find a single piece of paper proving they owned that house. I walked into the main boardroom on the 42nd floor. The space was a monument to corporate power, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling glass that offered a sweeping panoramic view of the downtown skyline. The long conference table was crafted from solid walnut and polished to a mirror finish. 12 senior executives from the bankrupt logistics firm were seated around the table. They wore expensive tailored suits, but they were sweating profusely. They knew exactly why I was there. I was the financial Grim Reaper sent to carve up their failed empire and sell the pieces to their competitors. I took my seat at the head of the table, opening my leather portfolio with deliberate slowness. The room was perfectly silent. I began systematically dismantling their business model using sharp, precise financial terminology to expose their reckless spending and catastrophic debt structures. I explained exactly how their assets would be liquidated and how their corporate bonuses would be clawed back to pay their furious creditors. The executives stared at me in terrified silence, realizing that their careers were officially over. Right in the middle of my presentation, my personal cell phone began to vibrate violently against the polished wood table. The bright screen illuminated, displaying Monique's name in bold letters. Normally, I would never interrupt a high-stakes liquidation meeting for a personal matter, but I knew exactly why my sister was calling. The frantic search for the deed had finally reached its breaking point. I decided that the men in the boardroom could wait a few moments. I picked up the phone, pressed the speaker button, and placed the device squarely in the center of the table. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair and waited for the performance to begin. "Justine, you vindictive little thief!" Monique's voice screamed out of the phone speaker, filling the massive boardroom. Her tone was absolutely hysterical, bordering on manic. "I know exactly what you did before you packed your bags. You thought you could sabotage our family, just because you are insanely jealous of me and Spencer. You sneaked into Dad's office and you stole the family documents." I glanced around the boardroom. The 12 executives were staring at the phone in total shock. They had never witnessed anything so incredibly bizarre during a corporate restructuring meeting, but they were too intimidated by my presence to utter a single word. I kept my expression entirely neutral, resting my hands lightly on the table. "I have no idea what you are talking about, Monique," I said smoothly, projecting my voice so the microphone would pick up every calm syllable. "I did not steal anything from that house." "Do not lie to me, you pathetic janitor," Monique shrieked, her voice cracking with pure panic. "Spencer set up a massive investment deal for us. He is going to make us millions of dollars and save the house, but the bank needs the original property deed today. We have searched everywhere. We turned the entire house upside down and it is completely gone. You took the deed to the house when you left. You took it because you want to see us fail. Put the deed in the mail right now or Dad is going to call the police and have you arrested for grand larceny." I could hear Calvin shouting furiously in the background. His voice was muffled, but his rage was unmistakable. He was yelling that I was a criminal and a permanent disgrace to the family name. I could also hear Spencer pacing heavily back and forth, muttering frantically about how the cryptocurrency market was moving and they were losing precious time. They were completely unhinged, acting like trapped animals turning on each other in the dark. I let Monique finish her breathless rant. I let her exhaust all her toxic energy, while the powerful men in my boardroom listened to every single desperate word. When she finally stopped to catch her breath, I rested my elbows on the table and steepled my fingers. Me, I said, my voice dropping to a low, terrifying register that commanded absolute silence. I did not steal the property deed. I never went into Dad's office, and I never touched his filing cabinets. Then where is it? Monique demanded, her breath hitching with fear. Where is the deed, Justine? Spencer needs it right now to save the family. I smiled a cold, calculating smile that made the executive sitting closest to me physically shudder and look away. The deed to that property is not missing, Monique. It is exactly where it is supposed to be. It is sitting securely inside a reinforced vault at a private bank in the financial district. There was a long moment of confused silence on the other end of the line. Why would you put our deed in a bank vault? Monique asked, her voice trembling with sudden deep uncertainty. You have no right to touch our property. Tell the bank to release it to Spencer immediately. I let out a soft, chilling laugh that echoed off the glass walls. You still do not understand, do you, Monique? You and Dad are so blinded by your own arrogance and your obsession with status that you never bothered to read the legal notices the county sent to the house. You never bothered to look at the name printed on the property tax assessments. You just assumed that screaming and demanding money would solve all your problems. What are you talking about? Calvin's voice boomed as he violently snatched the phone away from Monique. Justine, what game are you playing with my house? Give Spencer the authorization to retrieve the deed right now, or I swear I will ruin you. It is not your house, Calvin, I said, my voice perfectly steady and dripping with finality. It has not been your house for 4 long years. When you bankrupted your contracting business, the bank foreclosed on the property. You were days away from being thrown out onto the street and losing everything. To spare you the public humiliation in front of your precious friends, I stepped in and used my corporate resources to quietly purchase the foreclosed debt. I let you believe you had miraculously restructured your loan. The $3,500 you demanded from me every single month was not rent. It was my own money paying the taxes and insurance on my own property. The silence on the line was absolute and suffocating. It was the sound of complete catastrophic realization washing over them. I could picture my father's face turning ashen as the truth finally shattered his fragile ego. I could picture Spencer backing toward the front door, realizing his entire scam had just been obliterated by the very woman he tried to belittle. So you see, Dad, I continued, relishing the power of every single syllable. You cannot mortgage that house to fund Spencer's fake cryptocurrency project. You cannot offer the property as collateral to a predatory lender. The deed is sitting in a vault because I am the sole legally registered owner of that entire estate. And since you are currently trespassing on my property without my permission, I strongly suggest you start packing your bags. I pressed the red button on the conference room console, disconnecting the call and plunging the boardroom into absolute silence. The 12 senior executives seated around the massive walnut table stared at me with wide, terrified eyes. They had just listened to me casually dismantle my own family and inform my father that he was a squatter in my home. They were men who thought they were ruthless, but they were suddenly realizing they were sitting in the room with an absolute apex predator. I did not offer them any explanation or apology for the personal interruption. I simply picked up my silver pen and directed their attention back to the asset liquidation spreadsheets. I finished tearing apart their bankrupt logistics firm with cold, clinical efficiency, leaving them without jobs, without bonuses, and without any dignity. Back in the miserable suburbs, Calvin was undoubtedly destroying whatever was left of my old living room. For a narcissist, like my father, being saved from homelessness by the daughter he despised was not an act of grace. It was the ultimate emasculation. He could not process the fact that he was a financial failure. He could only process the profound humiliation of knowing that his lowly office cleaner daughter secretly owned the very walls that surrounded him. His ego simply could not allow him to accept reality. He managed to convince himself and the rest of the family that I had somehow manipulated the bank into stealing his property. He decided he needed a villain, so he set out to find a lawyer who would help him reclaim his precious kingdom. He scoured the bottom of the legal barrel and found Arthur Pendleton, a desperate strip mall attorney, who advertised on local television late at night, promising aggressive representation for people who could not afford retainer fees. 3 days later, I sat in the pristine glass-enclosed conference room of my personal legal counsel. The environment was a temple of corporate intimidation. My attorney was Richard Sterling, a senior partner at the most ruthless and expensive litigation firm in the city. Richard charged $1,000 an hour and wore custom-tailored suits that cost more than Calvin Carr. We sat calmly drinking sparkling water and waiting as the receptionist escorted my family and their bargain bin legal representation into the room. The contrast was almost painfully comical. Calvin marched in first, puffed up with false confidence, wearing the same tired suit he wore to church. Brenda trailed closely behind him, clutching a damp tissue, and playing her favorite role of the frail, weeping victim. Monique and Spencer hovered near the door, looking visibly intimidated by the towering skyscrapers visible through the panoramic glass walls. Then came Arthur Pendleton. He was a small, sweaty man carrying a scuffed leather briefcase that looked like it had been run over by a truck. He wiped his forehead with a handkerchief and tried to look tough in a room that vastly outclassed him. Arthur slammed his cheap briefcase onto the polished marble table, trying to establish dominance right away. He cleared his throat loudly and began shouting wild accusations into the quiet, air-conditioned room. He claimed that I had committed elder abuse, property fraud, and deceptive financial manipulation against my own loving parents. He pointed a stubby finger at me and demanded that I immediately transfer the deed of the house back into Calvin's name. He also demanded that I pay a massive financial settlement for the severe emotional distress I had caused my family. Calvin nodded vigorously, crossing his arms and glaring at me from across the table. He told me I was going to prison for stealing his legacy and ruining his life. Brenda began to produce loud, fake sobs, leaning heavily on Spencer for support. Monique sneered at me, telling me that my little scam was over and that justice was finally going to be served. Richard Sterling did not raise his voice or interrupt their chaotic performance. He simply waited until Arthur ran out of breath. Then my high-powered attorney opened a slim premium leather folder and slid exactly 4 pieces of paper across the smooth marble surface toward the sweaty little lawyer. I sat back and watched as the cheap attorney picked up the documents with trembling hands. The first piece of paper was the original foreclosure notice. I watched Arthur read the document, noting the date from 4 years ago. It bore Calvin's own frantic signature acknowledging his complete default on the mortgage and surrendering the property back to the bank. The second document was the public auction listing, proving that the bank had legally seized the asset and placed it on the open market for any qualified buyer to purchase. The third piece of paper was the clean, transparent wire transfer from my personal corporate holding account. It showed the exact massive sum of money I had paid to purchase the debt directly from the financial institution, completely bypassing my parents. The fourth and final document was the legally binding deed bearing my full name and the official raised seal of the state registry, making me the absolute undisputed owner of the estate. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the cold marble, and looked directly into Calvin's furious eyes. I explained every single financial mechanism with terrifying precision. I detailed exactly how his gross incompetence and desperate need to buy luxury items had caused the bank to throw him out. I explained how my money had saved him from sleeping on the street. I told him that every single payment he made to me over the last 4 years went directly toward the property taxes and the premium homeowner's insurance that protected my investment. I made sure every word hung in the air so that Spencer and Monique could hear exactly how pathetic my parents truly were. They had been living in a house of lies, and I had just burned it to the ground. Arthur Pendleton's face turned the color of wet ash. He looked from the bulletproof legal documents to Calvin and then back to the documents. He realized instantly that his client had lied to him completely. Calvin had told him this was a simple familial title dispute where a greedy daughter refused to hand over some paperwork. Calvin had never mentioned the foreclosure, the bankruptcy, or the public bank auction. Arthur knew that bringing a frivolous, fraudulent lawsuit against a massive firm like Richard Sterling would not just lose him. The case, it would likely get him permanently disbarred and heavily fined. The aggressive bluster completely vanished from his sweaty face. He shoved the pristine papers back across the marble table and slammed his scuffed briefcase shut. Arthur began backing toward the glass door, his eyes wide with panic. He muttered a frantic, terrified apology to Richard, stating clearly that he had been grossly misinformed by his client and that he was formally withdrawing his representation immediately. He did not even look at my parents as he grabbed the door handle. He practically ran out of the glass room, leaving Calvin completely and utterly abandoned by his supposed legal savior. Calvin stood frozen as the heavy glass door clicked shut behind his fleeing lawyer. The smug arrogance melted off his face, replaced by sheer primal rage. He looked around the room and realized he had lost everything. He was not a proud, wealthy homeowner fighting a righteous legal battle. He was a broke, delusional squatter facing imminent ruin in front of the people he wanted to impress the most. The profound humiliation snapped whatever tiny shred of control he had left in his brain. Calvin let out a guttural, animalistic roar and lunged across the wide marble table. His heavy hands reached violently for my throat, knocking over crystal water glasses and leather chairs. He wanted to physically destroy the daughter who had finally outsmarted him and exposed his failures. He never even got close to me. The two private security guards my attorney had stationed silently in the corners of the room moved with terrifying speed. They tackled my father, pulling him forcefully off the table and slamming him hard onto the expensive, thick carpet. They pinned his arms sharply behind his back, holding him down, while Brenda screamed in absolute horror. Monique jumped back, covering her mouth, while Spencer stood perfectly still, too cowardly to intervene or help the man he claimed to respect. I stood up slowly, looking down at the struggling man who had tormented me my entire life. I walked around the edge of the marble table and stood directly over him, staring into his furious, terrified eyes. "You just made your final mistake, Calvin," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that cut easily through the chaos of the room. "By bringing a fraudulent hostile legal action against the documented legal owner of your residence and attempting unprovoked physical violence, you have officially violated every standard morality clause of our implicit tenancy agreement." I signaled to Richard, who calmly slid one final crisp piece of paper onto the edge of the table where my family could see it. I looked back down at my father, who was still pinned against the floor by the heavy security guards. "Your previous 30-day eviction notice is no longer valid," I told him softly. "You are now considered a hostile physical threat to my property and my person. You have exactly 72 hours to vacate the premises completely. If you or your ridiculous guests are still inside my house when the clock runs out, the county sheriff will physically drag you out in handcuffs and throw your belongings into the street." The heavy glass door of Richard Sterling's office closed behind me, with a satisfying click severing the sound of my father's furious struggles against the security guards. The 72-hour eviction clock had officially started ticking down to their absolute ruin. I did not look back. I walked straight to my waiting car and directed my driver to take me back to my firm. The situation with my parents was handled legally and definitively, but there was one remaining loose thread that required my immediate attention. Spencer. He was the parasite that had accelerated my family financial collapse. He was the catalyst for their ultimate betrayal. I knew he was running a fake cryptocurrency operation out of an abandoned lot, but my instincts told me there was something much darker beneath his cheap linen suits and terrible cologne. I stepped off the private elevator onto the 42nd floor and walked briskly to my corner office. I locked the heavy oak door behind me and sat down at my polished mahogany desk. As a senior corporate liquidator, I possessed security clearances and access to restricted federal financial databases that standard investigators could only dream of. I bypassed the conventional civilian search portals and logged directly into the International Asset Tracking mainframe. I started by tracing the routing numbers associated with his fake company Apex Digital Holdings. The digital trail was deliberately convoluted, bouncing through shell companies in Delaware and offshore holding accounts in the Cayman Islands. But I spent my life dismantling the financial webs of ruthless billionaires. Spencer's sloppy digital footprint was child play. It took me exactly 3 hours of relentless forensic accounting to completely unravel his entire existence. His real name was not Spencer Davis. It was Spencer Thomas Wright. And he was not a venture capitalist. He was a highly documented serial grifter. I pulled up the sealed court records and active federal warrants from 3 different states. The pattern of his criminal behavior was sickeningly precise and deeply predatory. He specifically targeted successful independent women of color. He would infiltrate their lives, project an illusion of massive generational wealth, and isolate them from their financial advisors. Once he gained access to their accounts, he would drain their assets into untraceable cryptocurrency wallets and vanish without a single trace. He had embezzled hundreds of thousands of dollars from unsuspecting women in Texas, Illinois, and Georgia. He was currently a wanted federal fugitive, facing multiple counts of wire fraud, grand larceny, and identity theft. I sat back in my leather chair, staring at the horrific rap sheet illuminating my computer monitors. Spencer had not chosen Monique by accident. He had targeted her. He saw a desperate, insecure woman with a family that worshipped white proximity and status. He realized my parents were desperate to elevate their social standing, and he exploited that weakness flawlessly. He was using Monique to get to the supposed equity in our parents' house. He planned to drain the massive mortgage he had convinced Calvin to take out and then disappear, leaving my entire family facing federal bankruptcy and homelessness. A cold chill settled over my office. My family had treated me like absolute garbage for 29 years. They had evicted me, stolen my money, and attempted to destroy my professional reputation. Part of me wanted to sit back and watch Spencer strip them down to their very bones. It would be the ultimate poetic justice. But despite their horrific abuse, Monique was still my younger sister. She was arrogant, foolish, and deeply toxic, but she was about to marry a federal fugitive who would destroy her life forever. I decided I could not let that happen without attempting one final warning. I picked up my personal cell phone and sent Monique a brief text message. I told her we needed to meet immediately at a neutral location downtown. I told her I had urgent information regarding Spencer and the safety of her future. I did not expect her to agree, but 20 minutes later she replied with a sarcastic message telling me she would give me exactly 10 minutes of her valuable time. I chose a busy, upscale coffee shop in the financial district. It was a brightly lit space filled with corporate lawyers and investment bankers. I arrived early and secured a small round table near the back corner. I placed the thick manila folder containing Spencer Complete Criminal Dossier squarely in the center of the table. I ordered a black coffee and waited, and Monique arrived exactly 15 minutes late, making a grand theatrical entrance. She was wearing an oversized designer coat that clearly did not belong to her, and carrying a counterfeit luxury handbag. She strutted through the coffee shop, looking down her nose at the working professionals around her. She spotted me in the corner and marched over, her face twisted into a mask of pure condescension. She did not even bother to sit down. She stood over my table, crossing her arms defensively. "You have exactly 10 minutes, Justine." Monique snapped, her voice loud enough to draw the attention of the surrounding tables. "This better be a formal apology for the ridiculous stunt you pulled at the lawyer office today. Dad is still furious, and Spencer is working overtime to fix the mess you made." I did not raise my voice. I simply tapped the manila folder resting on the table. "Sit down, Monique," I said evenly. "I am not here to apologize. I am here to save you from making the biggest mistake of your entire life. The man you are planning to marry is a federal fugitive." Monique let out a sharp, obnoxious laugh. She looked around the coffee shop as if inviting the other patrons to share in the joke. "You are completely delusional, Justine. You are so consumed by jealousy that you are actually inventing pathetic lies. I opened the folder and spread the official documents across the table. I pointed to the clear, high-resolution mugshots from the Illinois State Police. I showed her the arrest warrants and the detailed financial records of the women he had defrauded. His name is Spencer Thomas Wright. I explained, my voice perfectly steady. He is a serial grifter. He targets women exactly like you. He isolates them, drains their bank accounts, and vanishes. He is currently wanted for multiple counts of wire fraud. He is only staying with you because he thinks Dad is going to secure a massive cash mortgage on the house. Once that money hits his account, he will abandon you completely. Monique stared down at the documents for a long moment. I could see the truth trying to break through her wall of aggressive denial. She looked at the mugshot. She looked at the dates of the arrest warrants. She saw the undeniable proof resting right in front of her eyes. But acknowledging the truth meant admitting that I was right. It meant admitting that she had been played for a fool. It meant giving up the illusion of the wealthy white savior she had paraded in front of her friends. Her fragile ego simply could not handle the massive psychological blow. Instead of processing the reality of the situation, Monique chose absolute explosive violence. Her face contorted into a mask of pure, hateful rage. She grabbed her large plastic cup of iced coffee from the table and hurled the contents violently across the space between us. The freezing brown liquid and crushed ice splashed heavily against my chest, soaking my expensive silk blouse and dripping down onto the table. The sudden violent action caused several people in the coffee shop to gasp and step back. "You are a bitter, pathetic liar," Monique screamed, her voice echoing shrilly off the high ceilings. "You fabricated all of this garbage because you are insanely jealous of me. You have always been jealous of me, Justine. You hate the fact that I found a brilliant, wealthy man who treats me like a queen. You are just furious because you know you could never land a rich, successful white man like Spencer. You are going to die alone in your sad little apartment while I am living in absolute luxury." I sat perfectly still. The ice-cold coffee soaked through my clothes, chilling my skin, but my heart rate did not elevate a single beat. I looked at the hysterical, screaming woman standing over me and realized that my sister was entirely beyond saving. She was so addicted to the toxic delusions my parents had fed her that she would willingly walk into her own destruction just to spite me. "You think your stupid little eviction notice scares us?" Monique continued, leaning aggressively over the table and pointing a manicured finger directly in my face. "You think you can control our family with your fake legal threats? Well, you are completely wrong, Justine. You have zero power over us. Spencer and I are moving up the timeline." She paused, breathing heavily, a crazed, triumphant look in her eyes. "We are getting married this weekend," Monique announced loudly, making sure everyone in the coffee shop could hear her declaration. "We are hosting the wedding right in the backyard of the family estate. We are inviting the entire neighborhood and all the church elders to witness our union. We are going to assert our dominance and prove to everyone that you are nothing but a jealous outcast. We own that house, Justine. You will never take it from us." She grabbed her counterfeit handbag and turned on her heel, preparing to storm out of the coffee shop in a blaze of dramatic glory. I did not shout back. I did not react to the public humiliation or the sticky coffee ruining my clothes. I slowly picked up a crisp, white paper napkin from the table and began calmly wiping the brown liquid from my collar. I looked up at Monique, stopping her dead in her tracks with the absolute dead calm in my eyes. "I think a backyard wedding is a truly brilliant idea, Monique," I said, my voice dropping to a soft, chilling whisper that carried perfectly across the quiet room. "Hosting a massive public gathering on my property this weekend is the perfect way to celebrate your new life. It will definitely be an incredibly memorable event." Monique frowned, her triumphant expression faltering as she tried to understand why I was not crying or begging or screaming in defeat. "Why are you smiling?" she demanded, her voice trembling slightly. I tossed the soiled napkin onto the table right on top of Spencer Federal mugshot. I smiled again, showing all my teeth in a smile that promised absolute devastation. "Because, Monique," I said smoothly, I have already taken the liberty of personally mailing invitations to some very special guests. I highly doubt Spencer will want to miss his own wedding once the agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation arrive to walk him down the aisle. I walked out of the coffee shop without looking back, leaving Monique standing frozen next to her table with a horrifying realization washing over her face. She knew I did not make empty threats. The federal agents were already building their case, and Spencer was rapidly running out of time. But I did not care about Spencer or his inevitable arrest anymore. My focus shifted entirely to the absolute collapse of the false empire my parents had built in their quiet suburban community. They had spent decades constructing a perfect facade of wealth and religious superiority, and now every single brick was coming loose. It was Wednesday evening when the final devastating blow was delivered to my father, carefully curated reputation. Pastor Thomas had spent 3 agonizing days reviewing the heavy black leather ledger I had dropped on his mahogany desk. He had traced every single fraudulent credit card swipe. He had verified the exorbitant interest rates that I had slaved away to pay off in secret. The truth resting on his desk was absolutely undeniable. Calvin was not a generous philanthropist favored by God. He was a financial parasite who had exploited his own daughter to buy the admiration of the congregation. The church board held an emergency meeting that very night, and the decision they reached was unanimous and merciless. The following Sunday morning, the sanctuary was packed with people dressed in their Sunday best. Calvin and Brenda sat in their usual front row seats, completely unaware of the impending storm. They expected Pastor Thomas to deliver a comforting sermon that would somehow validate their victimhood and paint me as the ultimate villain. Instead, the pastor stepped up to the pulpit with a heavy heart and grabbed the microphone. He did not preach his usual message of quiet forgiveness. He spoke about the devastating sin of pride and the deep toxic deception that had infiltrated their holy space. He announced to the entire congregation that all of the bronze plaques bearing Calvin's name would be immediately removed from the walls. He exposed the awful truth about the new stained glass windows and the expensive choir robes, explaining that the funds were obtained through the financial abuse of an innocent daughter who was forced into massive debt just to maintain a twisted illusion. The collective gasp that echoed through the church was absolute poetry. The very same people who had flooded my phone with digital outrage just days prior were now staring at my parents with pure, unadulterated disgust. The grand illusion was permanently shattered. Calvin and Brenda tried to stand up and defend themselves, but the heavy silence of communal rejection pushed them right back down into their seats. When the morning service finally ended, no one shook their hands. No one offered them polite smiles or words of encouragement. The long walk from the front pew to the parking lot was a humiliating parade of shame. Sister Mary, the woman who had texted me about my wicked soul, physically turned her back and shielded her children as my mother passed by. Deacon Williams, who had warned me of divine punishment, looked at my father with a sneer of open contempt. The men who used to seek business advice from Calvin now looked at him like he was carrying a highly contagious disease. The gossip spread through the suburban community like a blazing wildfire. By Monday morning, the perfect family was the ultimate pariah. My parents could not even walk into the local grocery store without hearing sharp whispers behind their backs. The cashiers who used to greet them warmly now refused to make eye contact. Calvin tried to show his face at his fraternal lodge, hoping to find some shred of loyalty among his peers, but he was quietly asked to leave the premises by men he once considered his closest friends. The social currency they had literally sold my soul to acquire was completely bankrupt. Brenda simply could not handle the sudden catastrophic loss of her social standing. She desperately needed to feel superior again, so she reverted to her favorite coping mechanism. She booked an emergency appointment at the most exclusive luxury hair salon in the city, hoping to find comfort in expensive treatments and shallow gossip. She walked through the glass doors wearing her finest clothes, demanding her usual champagne and the premium styling package. She sat in the plush leather chair for 3 hours, letting the stylists pamper her while she spun ridiculous lies about how our family was simply undergoing a private transition and how her ungrateful daughter was making up silly stories. But reality always catches up with people who live in a fantasy world. When Brenda approached the polished marble reception desk to pay her massive bill, she confidently handed over her shiny premium credit card. She stood tall, expecting the usual fawning treatment from the salon staff. The receptionist smiled politely and swiped the card through the machine. It beeped a harsh metallic sound, indicating a rapid decline. Brenda laughed nervously, claiming it was a simple bank error, and demanded the receptionist try the card again. The machine beeped a second time, loud enough for the entire quiet salon to hear. The receptionist looked at the screen and informed my mother in a very clear, unapologetic voice that the card was not just declined, but completely frozen by the issuing bank. All of those accounts had been linked to the massive web of debt that I had finally severed. The other wealthy clients in the salon stopped drinking their champagne and stared at the pathetic scene unfolding at the front desk. Brenda's face turned a violent shade of crimson. She frantically dug through her designer purse, searching for another card or a wad of cash, but she had absolutely nothing. Her entire existence had been funded by illusions and my stolen credit. The salon manager had to quietly escort her to the back office, forcing her to sign a humiliating promissory note while confiscating her designer sunglasses and an expensive watch as physical collateral. Brenda practically ran out of the luxury salon, her freshly styled hair ruined by the cold sweat of genuine panic. She finally realized that the walls were closing in, and there was no escape. I was sitting in my penthouse office overlooking the glittering city skyline when my phone began to ring. The caller ID displayed my mother number. For a brief moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail, but I knew this conversation was the necessary conclusion to years of agonizing emotional abuse. I needed to hear the exact sound of her defeat. I pressed answer and held the phone to my ear without saying a single word, letting the heavy silence stretch across the line. "Justine!" My mother's voice trembled through the speaker. She was not screaming. She was not demanding obedience. She had lowered her voice to a pathetic whimpering tone, playing the role of a desperate broken woman who just needed a little compassion. "Justine, please, you have to listen to me," she begged, her breath hitching with dramatic tears. "Things have gotten completely out of control. The people at the church will not even look at us. The grocery store clerk laughed at your father today, and the salon took my belongings. We have absolutely no money and nowhere to go. You cannot do this to us. You cannot throw your own flesh and blood out onto the freezing street. We are your family, Justine. You have to remember our blood ties. Please just cancel the eviction notice and let us stay in the house. We can start over and be a real family again. I promise everything will be different." I listened to her desperate, pathetic pleas while tracing the edge of a thick legal document resting on my glass desk. I remembered the terrible night she threw me out into the freezing rain. I remembered the absolute lack of mercy in her eyes when she told me I was useless and how she slammed the heavy door in my face without a second thought. I remembered years of being treated like a financial workhorse, while Monique was treated like royalty. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the silence stretch until I could hear her ragged, anxious breathing on the other end of the line. "You want to talk about family, Brenda?" I said, my voice as cold and sharp as a surgeon's scalpel. "You want to invoke blood ties now that your credit cards are declined and your fake friends treat you like a disease? 4 years ago, I stood in your hallway begging for a few more days to find a place to live. I was crying and terrified, but you did not care about blood ties then. Do you remember exactly what you said to me?" There was a choking sound on the other end of the line, but I did not let her interrupt. I let the question hang before delivering the final crushing blow. "You looked me right in the eyes, and you told me that failures do not belong in your house. You told me that no one gets a free ride. I am simply honoring the exact rules that you established. You built a life entirely on toxic lies and stolen money. Now the bill has finally come due and no one gets a free ride. I am not canceling the eviction. The sheriff will be at the front door exactly when the 72-hour clock runs out. You are a monster! Brenda shrieked, her pathetic, fragile facade completely vanishing as pure venom took over her voice. You are a cold, heartless monster, and I curse the day you were born. You are going to die completely alone, Justine. I hope you rot in that empty penthouse without anyone to love you. I did not bother listening to the rest of her hysterical, desperate curses. I simply pulled the phone away from my ear and pressed the red button, disconnecting her toxic energy from my life forever. I placed the phone gently on the glass desk and picked up my favorite silver pen. I looked down at the heavy legal contract resting in front of me. It was not a simple sales agreement or a residential transfer. It was a binding commercial development contract. I pressed the tip of the pen to the signature line and signed my name with absolute beautiful precision, finalizing the deal to sell the entire suburban property to a commercial demolition company. The House of Lies was going to be completely leveled to make way for a concrete parking structure, and there was absolutely nothing they could do to stop it. Saturday morning arrived with a crisp, clear blue sky that felt almost too perfect for the absolute destruction I was about to unleash. I sat at my kitchen island drinking black coffee and watching the digital clock on my tablet slowly tick closer to noon. The 72-hour eviction notice I had handed to my father in the lawyer office was entirely non-negotiable. I had spent the last 2 days finalizing the logistics with Apex Commercial Demolition, ensuring that every single permit was stamped and every heavy machine was fueled and ready to roll. My family actually believed they could ignore a legal mandate by simply throwing a party and pretending the problem did not exist. They thought that if Monique put on a white dress and Spencer stood under a floral arch, the sheer social weight of a wedding would magically protect them from reality. They were about to learn that heavy machinery does not care about floral arrangements. I dressed in a sharp, tailored gray suit that projected absolute authority and left my penthouse. I drove my luxury sedan toward the suburban neighborhood, taking my time and enjoying the smooth ride. About 2 miles away from the property, I pulled into a large commercial parking lot where the demolition crew was waiting. The site boss, a heavy-set man named Marcus, gave me a firm nod. Behind him sat 2 massive yellow bulldozers, 3 heavy dump trucks, and a crew of 20 men wearing hard hats and reflective vests. I rolled down my window and told Marcus it was time to go. The convoy of diesel engines roared to life, shaking the pavement beneath my car. I led the way, driving slowly down the familiar tree-lined streets of my childhood neighborhood, while an army of destruction followed closely in my rearview mirror. Back at the house, the situation was already unraveling into a spectacular disaster long before I even arrived. According to the private security team I had stationed down the street, the grand backyard wedding was an absolute ghost town. Monique had spent thousands of dollars of Spencer fake money to transform the dying lawn into a lavish paradise. She had ordered a massive white reception tent draped with expensive silk fabric. She had rented 200 white wooden chairs and lined the center aisle with towering pillars of imported white roses. She had even hired a classical string quartet to play elegant music as the guests arrived. But the guests never showed up. The community boycott was in full, absolute effect. Pastor Thomas had done his job perfectly, exposing my parents as toxic financial predators to the entire congregation. The people who used to flatter my mother and seek business advice from my father had completely turned their backs. Out of the 200 invited guests, maybe 15 people actually showed up. They were mostly clueless, distant relatives who had not heard the church gossip, and a few sketchy individuals wearing cheap suits who claimed to be Spencer business associates. Monique was reportedly having a complete meltdown inside the house, screaming at my mother and demanding to know why the chairs were empty. Brenda was probably hyperventilating, trying to invent ridiculous excuses about the weather or lost invitations, but the devastating truth was unavoidable. They were entirely alone. Despite the catastrophic lack of attendance, Spencer was insisting that they push forward with the ceremony immediately. He was visibly sweating through his tailored tuxedo jacket. He kept checking his expensive-looking counterfeit watch and pacing nervously near the floral altar. He did not care about the empty chairs or Monique-ruined dreams. He only cared about securing the legal marriage certificate. He knew that the fraudulent cryptocurrency scam he had sold to my father was on the verge of collapsing. He needed to be legally married to Monique so he could claim spousal privilege over whatever assets she supposedly possessed and legitimize his position in the family before he drained the mortgage cash he thought Calvin was securing. He kept leaning over and aggressively whispering to the hired officiant, demanding that they skip the long readings and just get straight to the vows. Just as the string quartet began to play the bridal march, and Monique stepped out of the back door wearing a ridiculously extravagant lace gown, the ground began to literally shake. The deep, rumbling vibration of heavy diesel engines drowned out the delicate sound of the violins. I turned the corner onto my old street and parked my sedan directly blocking the driveway. The massive yellow bulldozers pulled up right behind me, their heavy steel treads tearing into the perfectly manicured grass near the sidewalk. The dump trucks parked along the curb, completely barricading the front of the property. The noise was absolutely deafening. The few wedding guests sitting in the backyard stood up in total confusion, peering around the side of the house. The string quartet abruptly stopped playing. Monique stood frozen on the patio, her heavy lace veil blowing in the wind, her face twisted in pure shock as the sound of industrial machinery shattered her perfect moment. Calvin came storming around the side of the house, his face purple with rage. He was wearing a rented tuxedo that looked too tight across his shoulders. He saw the bulldozers crushing his precious front lawn and absolutely lost his mind. He ran sprinting down the driveway, waving his arms frantically in the air and screaming at the top of his lungs. He charged toward the lead bulldozer, demanding that the driver shut off the engine and threatening to sue the entire company for trespassing and property damage. I stepped out of my car, holding a bright red megaphone. I walked calmly up the front path, my heels clicking against the concrete. Two of my private security contractors stepped instantly in front of me, forming a solid physical wall between me and my furious father. Calvin tried to push past them, but the guards easily shoved him back, forcing him to stumble over the curb. Brenda came running out the front door, struggling to walk in her high heels, clutching her chest as she saw the sheer scale of the demolition equipment parked outside her home. Monique followed closely behind, dragging the heavy train of her wedding dress across the dirty concrete, her face stained with ruined mascara and tears of pure hatred. I raised the red megaphone to my mouth and pressed the button. My voice echoed loudly across the entire neighborhood, bouncing off the surrounding houses and cutting through the rumble of the idling diesel engines. Calvin and Brenda, I announced, letting my voice project absolute, unwavering authority. The 72-hour eviction window has officially expired. This property is now legally owned by Apex Commercial Demolition. You no longer have any right to occupy this land. Calvin screamed back at me, his face contorted in absolute fury. He yelled that I was a criminal, that I had stolen his legacy, and that he had squatter rights. He pointed a trembling finger at the bulldozers and demanded that they leave his property immediately before he called the police. I kept the megaphone raised to my mouth and smiled a cold, clinical smile. You have no squatter rights, Calvin. I broadcasted to the entire street, making sure the neighbors watching from their windows could hear every single word. You violated the terms of your legal notice the moment you attempted unprovoked physical violence against the rightful owner in a law office. The county sheriff has already been notified and approved this action. The house is scheduled to be leveled to the dirt starting right now. You have exactly 10 minutes to remove your personal belongings before the heavy machinery tears through the front door. Monique let out a high-pitched, completely unhinged shriek. She pushed past our mother and marched toward me, lifting the heavy layers of her white dress. You cannot do this, Justine, she screamed, tears streaming down her face. This is my wedding day. You are a jealous, bitter monster. You planned this just to ruin my happiness because you know you will never find a man who loves you. You are destroying my life. I lowered the megaphone and looked at my sister. Her expensive dress was covered in dirt. Her makeup was completely smeared, and her illusion of superiority was entirely shattered. I did not ruin your life, Monique, I said, my voice dropping to a sharp, piercing tone. You ruined it yourself the second you decided to trust a predatory grifter. Brenda collapsed onto the dying grass of the front lawn, wailing loudly and clutching her perfectly styled hair. She cried out to God, asking why she was being punished, and begging anyone to help her save her beautiful home. The few wedding guests who had wandered out to the front yard slowly began walking to their cars, realizing they had just walked into a massive, catastrophic legal nightmare. They did not say goodbye to Monique or offer any sympathy to Calvin. They simply lowered their heads and drove away, leaving my family standing completely alone in the shadow of the yellow bulldozers. I turned my attention away from my screaming father and weeping mother. I looked past the security guards and scanned the chaotic scene, searching for the one person who was noticeably absent from the screaming match. While Calvin was fighting the bulldozers and Monique was having a bridal breakdown, Spencer had quietly slipped away from the floral altar. He was not standing by his bride offering comfort. He was not defending my father's honor. Spencer was standing near the side gate of the property, observing the massive demolition crew and the private security contractors. I watched his eyes dart nervously around the street, assessing the situation with the cold, calculating logic of a career criminal. He saw the heavy machinery. He saw the utter destruction of my family financial facade. He realized in that exact moment that the massive mortgage cash he had been promised was never going to materialize. The house was gone. The money was a complete illusion. The grift was entirely dead. Spencer did not hesitate. He slowly backed away from the white reception tent, abandoning Monique without a second thought. He slipped quietly through the wooden side gate, disappearing into the thick bushes that lined the edge of the property. A moment later, I saw him emerge on the far side of the hedge, carrying a large, heavy duffel bag that he must have hidden there earlier that morning. He was making a clean, silent getaway while my family distracted everyone with their screaming. He thought he was brilliant. He thought he had outsmarted the system once again and could simply vanish into the wind to find his next wealthy victim. He turned his collar up, pulled his head down, and began walking briskly down the sidewalk toward the main intersection, putting as much distance between himself and the crying bride as possible. He made it exactly 50 yards down the quiet suburban street. The screech of heavy tires against asphalt pierced the air. Two massive black federal SUVs came tearing around the corner, driving aggressively up the wrong side of the road. They slammed on their brakes, fishtailing slightly before coming to a violent halt directly in front of Spencer, completely blocking his only exit path. The heavy doors of the SUVs flew open simultaneously. 6 highly trained agents, wearing dark tactical gear and protective vests, stepped out onto the street. The bright yellow letters FBI were emblazoned across their backs and chests. Spencer froze, dropping the heavy duffel bag onto the concrete sidewalk. His slick, confident demeanor instantly evaporated, replaced by the pathetic, terrified posture of a trapped rat. The lead federal agent drew his weapon and pointed it directly at Spencer's chest, shouting clear, aggressive commands for him to drop to his knees and lace his hands behind his head. Spencer's legs gave out, and he collapsed onto the concrete, his expensive tuxedo pants tearing against the rough pavement. Monique suddenly stopped screaming at me. The sound of the federal agents shouting commands had caught her attention. She turned her head and watched in absolute horror as the love of her life, the brilliant, wealthy venture capitalist who was going to save her family, was violently forced face down onto the sidewalk and handcuffed by federal authorities. She let out a strangled, confused gasp, unable to process the surreal scene unfolding at the end of her street. I raised the red megaphone to my mouth one final time. I looked at Monique, whose entire world had just been brutally dismantled in less than 5 minutes. "I told you this wedding would be incredibly memorable, Monique." I broadcasted, my voice echoing with pure, cold satisfaction. "The groom just caught his ride. Now get off my property before I have the bulldozers drive right over that ridiculous white tent." The federal agents did not hesitate for a single second. 2 of them grabbed Spencer by his tailored jacket and hauled him violently up from the concrete, while a third agent aggressively secured heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists. Spencer was whining and pleading, telling the agents there had to be a huge mistake, and claiming he was a legitimate venture capitalist who was just trying to get married. The lead agent simply laughed, a harsh, abrasive sound that carried perfectly across the dead, quiet neighborhood. He pulled a thick stack of warrants from his tactical vest and shoved them directly into Spencer's face. He loudly announced to the entire street that Spencer Thomas Wright was a wanted federal fugitive responsible for millions of dollars in wire fraud, identity theft, and interstate grand larceny. The few remaining wedding guests gasped in unison and immediately began sprinting toward their cars, desperate to avoid being questioned or associated with a major federal crime. The neighbors who had been watching the spectacle from behind their curtains now stood openly on their front porches, filming the entire humiliating arrest on their cell phones. Monique stood frozen on the ruined grass, her mouth hanging open in a silent scream. She stumbled forward, reaching out her shaking hand, as if she could somehow stop the federal agents from dragging her rich, handsome savior toward the black, armored SUV. The lead agent turned away from Spencer and walked slowly up the driveway, stepping over the crushed roses that had decorated the wedding aisle. He stopped directly in front of Calvin and Monique, pulling a small notepad from his pocket. He asked if they were the primary account holders for the Apex Digital Holdings investment portfolio. Calvin nodded frantically, his face pale and dripping with sweat. He demanded that the agent release his son-in-law and explained that Spencer was simply helping them secure a massive reverse mortgage to save their family estate from a wrongful eviction. The federal agent looked at my father with a mixture of profound pity and absolute disgust. He informed Calvin that there was no reverse mortgage and there was no investment portfolio. He stated clearly that Spencer had spent the entire previous night systematically bypassing their bank security protocols, using the personal information Monique had willingly handed over. The agent revealed that every single cent in Calvin Retirement Fund, every dollar of Brenda's secret emergency savings, and the entire remaining balance of Monique's personal checking account had been completely drained. The money was transferred into untraceable offshore cryptocurrency wallets just hours before the backyard wedding was supposed to begin. Spencer was never planning to marry Monique because he already had everything he came for. The reality of the agent's words hit the family like a physical shockwave. Calvin stumbled backward, clutching his chest as if he were having a massive heart attack. He realized in one terrifying instant that he had handed the keys to his entire financial existence over to a ruthless criminal. The prized white son-in-law he had paraded in front of the church congregation, the man he had used to justify throwing his own daughter out onto the street, had robbed them absolutely blind. They had zero money, zero credit, and zero assets left to their names. The illusion of their massive suburban wealth was officially dead, and they were entirely responsible for their own destruction. Monique let out a sound that I can only describe as a dying animal. The cognitive dissonance was simply too much for her fragile, arrogant mind to process. The beautiful fairy tale she had constructed to prove her superiority over me had violently shattered into a million sharp pieces. She fell to her knees in the dirt and began frantically tearing at the heavy lace fabric of her expensive wedding dress. She ripped the delicate white silk with her bare hands, screaming hysterically as she watched the federal agents shove Spencer into the back of the armored vehicle. The dress she had bought with stolen funds to marry a stolen man was now nothing more than dirty rags clinging to a broken, desperate woman. She rolled in the mud, thrashing and sobbing, while the neighborhood watched her complete mental collapse. Brenda was hyperventilating on the front porch, her legs giving out completely as she slid down the wooden stairs. She looked at the massive yellow bulldozers idling aggressively in the driveway, and then looked at me standing calmly by my luxury car with the red megaphone resting at my side. The absolute terror of imminent homelessness finally broke through her massive ego. The woman who had spent decades treating me like an indentured servant suddenly realized that I was the only person left on earth who held any power over her survival. Brenda crawled on her hands and knees across the crushed grass, destroying her expensive pantyhose, and dragging her designer silk blouse through the mud. She reached the edge of the driveway and threw herself forward, desperately trying to grab my ankles. My private security guards stepped in, immediately blocking her path and forcing her to stay back. Calvin scrambled forward, joining his weeping wife in the dirt. The proud, arrogant patriarch, who had demanded my absolute obedience, was now kneeling in the mud, begging for mercy. He cried loudly, pleading with me to stop the demolition crew and promising to do whatever I wanted if I just let them keep the house. He swore they would change and that we could go back to being a loving family. He actually tried to blame the entire situation on Spencer, claiming they were just innocent victims who had been manipulated by a master criminal and that I needed to show them Christian forgiveness. I looked down at the two miserable people weeping at my feet and felt absolutely nothing. There was no pity, no regret, and no lingering desire for their love. The toxic strings they had used to control me my entire life were completely severed. I stared into Calvin's desperate, bloodshot eyes and shook my head slowly. "You are not victims," I said, my voice steady and cold enough to freeze the summer air. "You are predators who finally found a bigger predator. You invited a parasite into your home because you were so blinded by your own greed and your desperate need for status that you ignored every single warning sign. You threw me away like garbage because I refused to fund your delusions anymore, and now you have exactly what you deserve. You have absolutely nothing." I reached into the pocket of my tailored suit jacket and pulled out the heavy metal keychain that held the keys to the rusted old car Calvin had mocked me for driving all those years ago. The same car that had been my only shelter when they locked me out in the freezing rain. I tossed the keys casually through the air, watching them land with a dull clink in the dirt, right between my trembling hands. "You can use that worthless piece of junk to haul your trash away," I told them, turning my back on their hysterical sobbing. I signaled to Marcus, the demolition boss, who was standing by the massive lead bulldozer. He nodded sharply and blew a loud air horn. The heavy diesel engines roared to a deafening pitch, vibrating the ground beneath my feet. The massive steel blade of the first bulldozer slammed directly into the ornate wooden fence that surrounded the property, crushing the heavy timber into splinters in a matter of seconds. The white wooden wedding chairs were flattened into dust as the machine rolled relentlessly forward into the backyard. The beautiful floral arches were pulverized under the heavy steel treads. I walked calmly toward my luxury car, opening the driver's side door and stepping into the pristine leather interior. I started the engine and put the car in gear, never once looking in the rearview mirror. I drove away down the quiet suburban street, leaving the deafening sound of crushing wood shattering glass, and the desperate wailing of my antagonistic family fading forever into the ruins of their own supreme arrogance. 6 months passed since that spectacular afternoon of absolute destruction. The sprawling suburban estate that once stood as a monument to my parents' toxic pride was completely erased from the face of the earth. In its place stood a sleek, highly profitable commercial parking complex managed directly by my firm. The smooth black asphalt covered the exact spot where my father used to host his lavish networking dinners. The automated ticket booths sat right over the dirt where my mother prized rose bushes used to grow. Every single day, cars drove over the remnants of their shattered empire, generating a steady stream of passive income for my corporate accounts. It was the ultimate poetic justice. They had treated me like a worthless investment, and now their precious land was quite literally paying my salary. While I was expanding my portfolio and climbing to the very top of the financial world, my family had plummeted to the absolute bottom of the socioeconomic ladder. Calvin and Brenda were currently living in a cramped, dingy one-bedroom apartment on the extreme outskirts of the city. The building was notoriously run down, with peeling paint, flickering hallway lights, and neighbors who screamed through the thin walls at all hours of the night. There were no more crystal chandeliers or vaulted ceilings. There were only dripping faucets and the constant suffocating smell of cheap stale cooking oil. They had absolutely no money left to hide behind. The federal government had seized whatever assets they tried to conceal, and the remaining debts completely buried them. Calvin, the proud patriarch who used to wear custom-tailored suits and lecture me about the value of hard work, was now forced to work a grueling night shift as a warehouse packer. His aging joints ached constantly as he lifted heavy cardboard boxes for minimum wage. He had to clock in exactly on time and take orders from a manager who was half his age. The men from his fraternal lodge never called him. The pastors from the church acted like they had never met him. He was entirely invisible, just an exhausted old man wearing a stained yellow safety vest. Brenda suffered an equally humiliating reality. The woman who used to spend her afternoons sipping imported wine at luxury hair salons was now working as an industrial janitor. She spent her days pushing a heavy yellow mop bucket down the long, fluorescent hallways of a public high school. The harsh cleaning chemicals caused her hands to blister and peel, ruining her perfectly manicured skin. She had to scrub toilets and empty trash cans while teenagers ignored her existence. She no longer had any wealthy friends to gossip with. Her entire social circle had abandoned her the very second the FBI raided her beautiful home. She was completely isolated, drowning in a sea of minimum wage labor and bitter regret. But perhaps the most satisfying downfall belonged to Monique, my deeply arrogant sister, the woman who believed she was destined for a life of effortless luxury alongside a wealthy white savior, was now working as a cashier at a massive discount supermarket. It was the exact same supermarket chain she used to mock me for shopping at when I was a struggling college student. She was forced to wear a hideous green polyester uniform vest that made her sweat under the bright store lights. She stood on her feet for 8 hours a day, scanning cheap canned goods and bagging bruised produce for impatient customers who snapped at her when she moved too slowly. Monique's digital empire had completely collapsed. The video of Spencer being arrested by federal agents on her wedding day had gone incredibly viral within our community. The public humiliation was so absolute and so entirely devastating that she was forced to permanently delete all of her social media accounts. There were no more filtered photos of designer handbags or expensive dinners. There were no more sycophantic followers telling her how beautiful and blessed she was. She had no friends left. The girls she used to party with wanted absolutely nothing to do with the bride of a convicted federal fraudster. She went to work, she scanned barcodes, and she went back to a tiny rented room. She was completely trapped in the mundane working-class reality she had spent her entire life running away from. As for Spencer, his brilliant criminal career had come to a permanent and highly documented end. He had tried to offer a plea deal, but the federal prosecutors had an ironclad case built on mountains of financial evidence. He was sentenced to 10 hard years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. There would be no more tailored linen suits and no more smooth talking his way into the bank accounts of insecure women. He was just another numbered inmate sitting in a cold, concrete cell. I thought about all of them as I stood in my massive executive corner office on the top floor of a gleaming glass skyscraper. The sun was beginning to set, casting a brilliant golden light across the city skyline. The heavy mahogany doors of my office were closed, shutting out the quiet hum of my busy staff working in the outer suites. I walked over to my custom marble desk and picked up a thick stack of finalized legal documents. I had just closed the largest corporate liquidation deal of my entire career. It was a massive multi-million-dollar contract that officially cemented my status as a senior partner at the firm. I had built an empire using nothing but my own brilliant mind and my absolute refusal to be broken by the people who were supposed to protect me. My personal cell phone buzzed softly against the cold marble surface of the desk. The screen lit up, glowing brightly in the dimming office. I glanced down and saw a massive block of text from an unsaved number, but I instantly recognized the desperate, pleading tone of the opening sentence. It was Brenda. The message was a long, frantic essay of pure misery. She wrote about how much her back hurt from scrubbing floors and how Calvin was coughing through the night. She begged me to remember the good times we supposedly shared when I was a little girl. She pleaded for a second chance, asking if we could just meet for a cup of coffee so she could explain her side of the story. She ended the massive text by asking if I could possibly loan them a few $1,000s just to help them catch up on their overdue rent. She swore they would pay me back and promised that they finally realized how wrong they had been. I picked up the phone and stared at the glowing letters. 5 years ago, a message like this would have sent me into a spiral of guilt and desperate hope. I would have drained my own savings to rescue them, believing that maybe this time they would finally love me. But standing in my executive office, looking down at the city I practically owned, I felt absolutely nothing. There was no anger left in my heart. There was no sadness and no desire to punish them any further. They were already living in the exact hell they had built for themselves. I did not type out a cruel response. I did not demand an apology or list the million reasons why they deserved to suffer. I simply pressed the delete button, watching her desperate, pathetic words vanish into the digital void. I blocked the number permanently, ensuring that their toxic misery could never reach me again. I set the phone down and walked slowly over to the massive floor-to-ceiling windows. I stepped out onto my private glass balcony, letting the cool evening wind wash over my face. The city stretched out below me, a vast glowing grid of endless opportunity and infinite success. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the crisp, clean air of absolute victory. I had survived their abuse. I had outsmarted their greed, and I had dismantled their lies. I smiled a quiet, genuine smile as I looked out at the beautiful horizon. I finally understood that I did not need their love to survive. I had secured my own future, and I knew with absolute certainty that financial freedom and undeniable independence were the sweetest revenge of all. The true measure of our worth is never defined by those who are blinded by their own arrogance and greed. When toxic family members try to tear you down and exploit your kindness, the most powerful response is not a screaming match, but the quiet, relentless pursuit of your own independence. You cannot heal in the same environment that broke you. By walking away and building your own success, you create an unbreakable shield. Financial freedom and inner peace are the ultimate justice. Real family is built on mutual respect, not blood, and your best revenge is just thriving alone. If you have ever had to walk away from toxic relatives to protect your own peace, share your empowering story in the comments below and subscribe for more.